Hello ladies and gentle ladies, and welcome back to another Minecraft modding tutorial for Forge 1.20. And in this tutorial we are going to be covering block entities. So first of all, let's discuss what a block entity is and why you may want one and exactly what we're going to be doing with one. So first of all, a block entity is effectively an entity but for a block. So it can store data, it can tick, it can form special functions and a bunch of stuff like that, and it can also hold its own renderer as well, which allows you to do special rendering for your blocks. But that's more of a future thing which we will talk about later. Now, why would you want a block entity? Well, I think that's fairly self-explanatory now that you know what a block entity is. So for example, in vanilla, a furnace is a block entity, a beacon is a block entity, all those kind of machiney kind of blocks are all block entities. An exception being something like a crafting table, because it doesn't actually store anything, it doesn't really do anything. The only functionality is when you click it, and that can just be achieved by any old block. So let's get started and let's set this all up. I've already created the block item inside of item init. I've done the lang, the block model, and also the item model. And I've also registered a basic block in here, which I've called example block entity, which isn't really a great name, and we'll talk about why later. And also in this tutorial, I'm going to be covering kind of how you can add special properties to your block as well. So that will be kind of unrelated to block entities, but I figured it would fit in this tutorial better anyways. So I'm going to do that as well. Things such as rotation will be in this tutorial too. And you can view all the timestamps for everything in the description below. So I've created this basic block here. And the important thing to note is that we are using a registry object of a block, just a normal block. Now if you see, our ores up here are using a drop experience block, and that allows them to perform their special functionality, which you can see in here. So effectively we need to do the exact same thing. So let's create a new package inside of our main package, and I'm just going to call this block. And inside of here I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call this example block entity block. That's actually not a very good name, so I'm actually going to rename this whole kind of thing to just example advanced block, since I would consider this a more advanced block. But you shouldn't call it that, of course. You would call it what your thing actually is. For example, if you're making a furnace, you would call it furnace block. If you're making some kind of machine, you would call it machine block, or whatever, that kind of thing. When it comes to block entities, there are lots of different ways of doing things. So I'm just going to be covering one way, but I'm going to try and talk about the other possible ways that you could do things. Whichever one is correct or which is better is always debated in the modding community. So I'm going to try and show you both, but I'm only going to be sticking with the one that I personally use, the one that I think is easier and just makes more sense to understand. So this block class, you can do two things here. Two possible things. First of all, you can just extend block. Fairly simple, right? So you just have a normal block, which ideally is what you would do, because maybe you want to extend something special, right? So maybe you wanted to extend a fence block. You can do that with this first method. So that's the one I'm going to show you first. You extend block. And then what you need to do is implement entity block. And once you've done that, you implement your methods, which will be a new block entity method. And you also add your constructor, which is the properties. We can just rename this to the pos and the state. Okay, so that is the first way that you can achieve adding a block entity. Now, the other way that is done sometimes, and personally, I would not recommend you do this, but you can do it if you want, and that is extending base block entity. Base entity block, I mean. And if you do that, that works too. Now, the reason I wouldn't do that is because that means you can't extend anything else. So obviously inheritance, we don't have multi-inheritance in Java, thankfully, so you can't extend 2 classes, you can only extend 1 class. So if you wanted to use all of the stuff from fence block, you would actually have to copy all of this instead of just, extending fence block like this, because you can't do that if you're extending base entity block. You can't do like fence block, right? Because that doesn't work. You'll see class cannot extend multiple classes because, yeah, of course it can't. So if you do that, you don't need to implement entity block, but I think just extending block or whatever block class you want to extend and then implementing entity block is much better. Now, if we look in base entity block real quick, you'll see there's actually a few things going on in here that might be a reason you want to use it. So first of all, we have this method here, get render shape, and this returns invisible. Now what this does is effectively the actual rendering of this block will be invisible unless you override this method to change it. So by default, right, get render shape, if you look at the default implementation, you'll see that it returns model. But if you're extending base entity block, by default that's going to be invisible. So you would actually have to override model in that, which is a bit silly, right? So that's one reason I also wouldn't use that, because you have to do this for all of your blocks that extend base entity block, which is silly. It's really silly. Now, another thing, if we go into base entity block, you'll see there are some methods here. So first we've got trigger event. This is just for like Vanilla's event triggering system, which is really bad, let's be honest. I wouldn't really worry about doing this. You can implement this if you want, like in here, but I don't think there's any point really. I don't think most people use it because it's a not very good system, but you could do that if you want. So that is one benefit of using this, because you don't have to copy this in. And same with git menu provider as well, but that will be for menus, which we'll cover later, and I personally don't do it this way anyways, but that is also an option. And the other benefit is that you have this method right here, create ticker helper, which will be used for our block entity ticking later on. But for now, we won't touch ticking. That will be in the next tutorial. Okay, so now we've discussed all of the things that all of the possible ways of constructing your block entity block class. Let's talk about block properties. So this is the part that's unrelated to block entities. So let's say we want this block to have different rotations, so it can face different directions. What we want to do is we want a public static final, and we can do a direction property, and you can call that facing, and you have 2 options here. First of all, you can do direction property dot create, and then you can give it a name. So for example, facing, and that would work. And you can alternatively pass in the specific directions that you want this to work for. You could also do like direction.values, and that would work fine. So that would give you all the default directions. That would be down, up, north, south, west, or east. Alternatively, you can use block state properties dot, and you have facing and horizontal facing. So I'm just going to use horizontal facing for this one, because it's just a lot simpler. You only have north, south, east, west instead of up and down as well. And you can just do that, which is much simpler. And then all you need to do is override the method. Let's see, what's it called? I always forget what this method's called. Create block state definition. There you go. And this is the builder here, so you just rename that. It's generally quite important that you keep the super, especially if you're extending something that isn't a block or isn't just the generic block class. For example, if I was extending the fence, right, if I come into here and into cross collision block, you can actually see they have some Boolean properties in here, which if you look down here, they should be added to a state builder. Maybe not. Vanilla does things slightly weird quite often, so you might find that Vanilla doesn't do it this way. How do they do it actually? That's very strange. I'm not sure, but we need to do it this way anyways. So you just do like builder.add facing. And obviously let's go back to extending normal block. Now there is an alternative to doing this. If you just want horizontal facing, you can actually just extend horizontal directional block, which does that whole thing for you. Actually, it doesn't add it to the state builder, which is very interesting. But yeah, you'll need these as well, which you can copy from your horizontal directional block. I will just extend that. And then that means I don't need to create this facing property up here because it's already in the superclass. So all we need to do in that circumstance is override the create block state definition and add it to the builder. Nice and simple. Now, what if you wanted a different kind of property, right? What if you wanted a Boolean for whether it's turned on or not? Or maybe you wanted some kind of enum for maybe like a different part. For example, if you're doing some kind of multi-block, beds, for example, you would have some kind of enum property of type, maybe like example block.half, and you might call this half is equal to enum property dot create, give it your name, half, and then half dot class, and then you would have some kind of like public enum half, and you would say maybe something like lower and upper, and you might have other halves as well. Maybe you have 3 halves, so you have a middle as well, but I'll just say lower and upper for this example. And if you do that, you just need to make sure it implements string representable and implement the correct method for that, and you'll just want to return the different thing. So generally what you would do here is you would have a private final string name, and you would have your constructor, which just is not public because enums don't need a public constructor, which would take in your name, and then you would just do this.name is equal name. And then these have to just put in a name, so lower, upper, and just return in serialized name this.name. Alternatively, obviously, you could just do return name.to lowercase locale.root. That would work too, but generally it's better to actually create a name property that you use in the constructor of the enum. But that's just basic Java stuff, really. I'm not too worried about using any of that, so I'm going to remove that. Oh, and obviously make sure you would add it to your builder as well. So you do builder.add half. And actually you can do that in a one-liner. And yeah, boom, that would work. But I'm going to remove that. I'm not too worried about having any kind of other properties here other than just your direction property. Okay, moving on. So we can go back to block entities now. We need to actually create a block entity that we can return in this new block entity method. So first of all, block entities do need to be registered. So as you can probably guess, we're going to come into our init package, and we're going to go block entity type init, and this is just going to have your usual. In fact, I'm not going to have the type part because with entities we didn't have the type. We'll just go without the type, and then we'll go public static final deferred register, and this will be of type block entity type, and that'll just be wildcard, and you can call this block entities is equal deferred register dot create forge registries dot block entity types, and then just your mod ID, so tutorial mod dot mod ID, and we can put that on a new line just to keep it within the bounds. And then you would just do as usual your public static final registry object of block entity type. This will be of type your block entity class, which we'll create in a moment. I'm just going to call that example advanced block entity, and I'm going to call that example advanced block entity is equal block entities dot register. Give it your name as you usually would do. So we'll give it the name example advanced block entity. Once again, as usual, that needs to follow the general conventions, so lowercase, no spaces, no special symbols, etc. And we're going to give it a supplier of block entity type dot builder dot of. There you go. And then you can do example advanced block entity or your block entity class colon new, and then you'll also see that it asks for an array of blocks. So that is basically the blocks that are valid for this block entity. So we'll just pass in block init dot example block entity dot get and end that off. Now obviously we have an error here, and actually that's not right because that's used that, but we want that. So we do have errors here because obviously we haven't created our block entity class. So what I'm going to do inside of the block package, I'm going to create a new package called entity. You can do that. Alternatively, you can just create a new package inside of your main package called block entity. Those are the two alternatives. I think I'm going to stick with the block entity so that we can keep it more separate, and we'll just create a class with that name. All you need to do here is just extend block entity and add your constructor. So you first have the type, the block pos, the block state. So let's rename the block pos to pos and the block state to state. And we're going to remove the block entity type, and we're just going to pass that directly in here. So block entity init.example advanced block entity.get. And boom, that is your block entity. That should be this error gone. That is not this error gone. So this is a builder, right? It's a builder pattern. So you have to build the builder. So you have to do dot build, and you can just pass in null. It says it can't be null. Don't worry about that. It can be null. That's effectively for data fixers, which if you don't know what that is, it's what Mojang uses to update to different or update to newer versions. It allows them to just transfer data, and they write code that allows them to do that, and that's what data fixers are for. It does literally what the name suggests. It fixes the data to work in the new version. But for mods, we don't need to do that. You could do it, but you would need to read a whole PhD paper on how it works, and that's how complicated it is. So needless to say, I'm not going to be covering that because no one does it. Not even the biggest mods like Immersive or Mechanism do that kind of thing. So we won't be doing that. Instead, what we will do is make sure we register our deferred register, as we always have to do. In the main class, you guessed it, block entity init dot block entities dot register bus. So that is that registered. Now inside of our block class, all we need to do is go block entity init dot example advanced block entity dot get dot create, and then we just pass in the pos and the state, and boom, that is our block entity created. So I'm briefly going to cover how we can store data in our block entity, and then how we can access that in our block class, and then we'll go ahead and test it. So in our block class, first of all, I'm just going to create a use method. I'm going to override that, and I'm real quick going to name these parameters. Oh, by the way, yeah, if you get this where it says overrides deprecated method, don't worry about that. Basically, vanilla deprecates a bunch of stuff in their code, but it doesn't actually mean that it's deprecated. It actually means that you just shouldn't call that method. You can still override it. So it's a misuse of deprecated, really, but they do that, and it just kind of is what it is. Don't worry about it too much. It will give you a warning, but you just have to put up with it. You can actually, if you really want to, you can suppress warnings and deprecated. I'm pretty sure you can do that. I think IntelliJ is just being a bit wonky. What we want to do is we want to say if. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make it say something in chat when we right click the block. What we need to do is say if not level dot is client side. So we want to check that we are on the server side, and then we're just going to say, first of all, we're going to get the block entity. So block entity, and I'll call that block entity. Oh, actually, I'll call this BE is equal level dot get block entity at the pos, and I'm just going to say if BE is instance of, and then our block entity class, and then I'll call that block entity. So if that is the case, then we're going to say we're going to get the data first. So we're going to say int counter is equal block entity dot get counter. And we'll create these things in a second. And then all we just do is player dot send system message component. And I'll just do a literal component here just to keep it simple. Block entity has been used %d times, and I will just format that with the counter. So a fairly simple thing there. You just send a simple system message to the player saying when you click on it, it will say this block entity has been used and that number of times. So let's create this counter stuff for our block entity, and we want to save that data as well. So we're going to come into our block entity. We're first going to create the integer, so private integer counter. This is just the data I'm going to be using, by the way. You can obviously store any data in here that you want. And actually what you might want to do is just something more like block entity dot increment counter. And I'll show you why in a second. And all you want to do is first override the load method. and that takes in a compound tag. So this tag is actually the NBT of your block entity. And you do want to make sure you call this super.load. That is very important, as that is what saves capabilities and other persistent data, which we'll be covering soon. And all you want to do inside of load is you want to say this.counter is equal nbt.getInt, and we'll call that counter. So we're just loading some basic NBT data. We're loading an integer specifically with the name counter, and obviously you can use nbt.get and whatever other data type you want. Obviously you'll see not every data type is here, so sometimes you'll have to construct your own. For example, using get compound, think of that as like an object, and you can insert into that object and you can get from that object. So this compound tag here, for example, that is a compound, so that is an object, and you're able to get data from that object. Now, I should say one thing that some people may recommend you do is you actually always save your data inside of a mod ID. So for example, you might always do something like compound tag tutorial mod data is equal nbt.getCompound tutorial mod.mod ID, and then you might do, instead of nbt.getInt counter, you might add tutorial mod data.getInt counter. Now, the reason you sometimes might do this is because other mods might add their own data to your NBT. Maybe they want to save something specific with something, and you just want to make sure that they don't accidentally put the data in the same variable as you're saving your data. So often it's recommended, you don't have to do this, and honestly I don't do this because I'm a bit lazy, generally should put it in your own compound called mod ID, and now just make sure you're not going to have a conflict. It's effectively impossible that you would have a conflict unless the other mod is specifically trying to overwrite your data, in which case that's a completely different scenario. If you're not super worried about compatibility with super niche mods, then don't do this, but generally I think it's a good idea to do that kind of thing. I'm not personally going to do it because I think it is in a way a bit silly. The chances that that would happen are extremely low, and if it does happen, you're just going to get a bug report and you can fix it, but it's up to you. It's up to you whether you do that. I'm not going to, but yeah, and that will load it from the NBT, right? So you obviously need to make sure you also save it. So you want to override the method save additional, and once again this takes in an NBT, and once again you want to make sure you call the constructor there as well, the super method, not the constructor. Don't know what I'm on about. And this is going to be as you would expect really, nbt.putInt, and you would just say counter and this.counter, and boom, that would put your integer counter in there. And obviously likewise as before, you can put other data in here, and if you do put, for example, that allows you to put a new compound tag. So once again, if we were putting it in our mod ID, you might first create a compound tag, so var tutorial mod data is equal to a new compound tag, and then you might do tutorial mod data dot put int, and you might then put your counter into that, and then instead of put int here, you might do put tutorial mod data and tutorial mod.mod ID. You might do something like that, and you might just let's load it. In fact, I will just for this example do it that way, just so that you guys can always see how that is done. So nbt.getCompound tutorial mod.mod ID, and then just do tutorial mod data.getInt, and boom. I'll leave it like that just so you can see how that is done if you wish to do that. And I think it is maybe better for an example that I do show you that. Okay, now one very important thing to notice here, or one important thing to mention really, is that this is not going to sync. Right, this data is not going to be synced to the client. So by default, this data is only going to be on the server side of this block entity. So if you wanted to render it, for example, or you wanted to access it in a GUI, that's not going to work. And so you would have to sync the data. I will talk about that in a future tutorial. I'm not going to talk about that in this one because as you can see, we're already getting way longer than I intended us to get. So we'll just leave it like that. Now we do just need to create this increment counter method. So let's just quickly go ahead and do that. We're just going to do this dot counter, and we'll do plus plus this dot counter. So return plus plus this dot counter, and that just increments the counter like that. Obviously, if we did it at the end, then it would increment afterwards, but I'm just going to do it like that, so that works perfectly fine. And you could also just create a method for like getting the counter maybe instead of incrementing. So you might want something like get counter, and that just returns this dot counter. And yeah, that would work perfectly fine too. I'll leave that method there just so we can maybe use it in the future. We'll see. And yeah, that should all work perfectly fine. We do just need to do the very important thing. If you notice at the top of our class here, it says this class is not ever used. So we do just need to come into block init and make sure we're using that instead of the block class. So if we just put that in there and give that a save, that should all work. We do, however, need to actually return something in this use method, and we need to return an interaction result. So if we reach this part right here, we just want to return interaction result dot sided success level dot is client side, and then else we're just going to return super and fantastic. Yeah, that does still give us the deprecated error because once again IntelliJ is being stupid, but you can just ignore that and it would be perfectly fine. Now, one important thing to notice is that since we are using a horizontal direction property, so we're using a facing property, you need to add that to your block state file. So if we just go assets tutorial mod, I'm going to copy this block state right here, and I'm going to call this example block entity. And inside of here, we're just going to want to add those facings. So facing is equal north. You're going to want this model here, just your like default model, nothing special. Then we can say facing is equal east, and we want to say that the model is going to be the same. But for the east one, you just want to add y 90. So that just means it will rotate 90 degrees on the east. And then you just want to do the exact same for the south and for the west. So for the south and west. So for the south, you just rotate 180, and for the west, you rotate 270. And boom, that would work. Now, obviously, you could also return different models for your different directions as well. Say, for example, you would return maybe an east model for the east direction, and etc. And that's how you would handle different textures for different states as well. So the furnace, for example, you would have a property such as lit equals true, and then you would say your model is going to be something like example block entity underscore lit, and that would be your lit model. If you had multiple properties, by the way, you need to make sure you specify all properties in this file. So if you had facing and lit, such as the furnace does, you would have to do all of these. So you would have all of these, but you would have lit equals false for all of these ones. And then you would copy them all, you would paste. And for these ones, you would just go lit equals true. And obviously you would have your lit ones at the bottom here. Oops, I've done that wrong. And you see how this would get very long if you started to have a lot of different properties. You want to try and keep your properties to a minimum. If you find that you have a lot of properties that you need, then maybe you need to start considering whether you need a block entity and just kind of do it like that instead of having them all as block states, because the more block states you have, it will exponentially increase your memory usage. So you want to try and keep the amount of block states you have to an absolute minimum. For example, in this circumstance, even though we only have a facing property and a lit property, we actually have 8 different block states here, 8 different block states. You have facing north with lit false, you have facing north with lit true, you have facing east with lit false, etc. So that's 8 different states when you only have 2 properties. So that is just an important thing to note, and I will go ahead and undo all of those. Okay, and obviously you need to do your block model, your lang, your item model, your etc. I'm not going to create a texture, by the way, so we'll have to just imagine there's a texture when we get in the game. But let's go ahead and run it, and let's kind of see what happens, shall we? Alright, ladies and gentle ladies, so here we are in the game, and I've gone ahead and got the example block entity out. You'll see it has the same item model as this one. I accidentally gave it the wrong item model, but I couldn't be bothered to restart the game, so just ignore that. But if we place it down, you can see that it places, and if we go F3, you can actually see that it has a facing of north. And if I place it this way, yes, that is something very important that I did forget to do. So let's just come back in the block class real quick here. And if we override the method get state for placement. Okay, now one thing you will want to make sure you do in the constructor is you want to call the method register default state. And for that, you just do this.state this.default block state .set value, and you just want to do facing and direction .north. It's generally recommended that you do kind of set your default register state to have a specific property, and you would do that, you'd just chain that for all the rest of your properties. Say you had lit, for example, you would then do lit true as like your default, or lit false would be your default state. That is just something that you should do. But that wasn't the actual issue we're having. The issue is in here with the get state for placement. And what you want to do in here is you just want to return default block state .set value facing context .get horizontal direction .opposite. And that just makes sure it always places in the opposite direction from the way you are facing. And if I just now go ahead and rerun the game, we should see that work. So now that we're back in the game, we can see this still has the north facing. And if I place this down, you see that's now south. If I place it that way, it's west. If I place it that way, it's north. And if I place it that way, it's going to be east. So you see it always faces the opposite direction that you place it, which is just how like the furnace works. For example, if I do furnace, you see that it places towards me, even though I'm facing the other direction. So that's just what it does. It's a bit hard to see when you obviously don't have a texture for it, but yeah, I think you kind of get the point on how that does work. Now, I don't know why I destroyed those, because I need that to show you the block entity counter. So what we're going to do is we're going to click it. Now, one important thing to note, and I didn't really talk about this, is that yes, it clicks 2 times. Now, the reason is you actually have 2 hands, funnily enough. You have your left hand and your right hand. And I know I did those the wrong way around, but shush. And yeah, so it actually clicks twice. Now, obviously, if you don't want it to do that, then you would simply just do and hand is equal interaction hand dot main hand. And that just makes sure that it will only click once. Obviously, we can't test that without restarting the game, which I'm not going to do. And if we click it a few more times, you see it increments. So we get to 30. Now, if we leave the game and we load back in, we should be able to see that when we click it, it should go 31, 32 because it's starting from 30. Oh, that's not quite right. Okay, so once again, I realize I've made a little bit of a silly mistake here. So when you save data of a block entity, you need to actually call a method, right? So if we come back into IntelliJ, where we increment the counter here, what we really want to be doing is, instead of just returning it, right? So you might do this.counter ++, but then you want to actually call the method setChanged and then return this.counter. And the reason you do that is because that effectively tells Minecraft that, okay, this block has changed, it needs to save its data. So if I just hot swap here, which hopefully will work, which it has. Now, if I right click it, you see it's been used 10 times. We'll go up to 15. Now, if we save and quit and we load back in, we should see it starts at 15. So let's just see. Yeah, there you go. It's 16, 17, 18. We'll go up a little bit. So I'll just hold it down a little bit. And also you can see it only increments once now because we're checking the hand. We'll go up to like 59 and we'll save and quit and load back in, and we should start at 60. So let's test if that works. Yeah. Boom. So that is perfectly fine. One thing you could just really quickly do is add a way to say if they're shifting, then we don't want to increment, we just want to get it. So we can say, for example, int counter is equal player dot shifting is shift key down. No, we don't want that. We want crouching. If they're crouching, then we do block entity dot get counter. Else we just do block entity dot increment counter. If we go ahead and hot swap that, you see that we can increment still by just pressing right click. But if I hold shift, it says the same value. And that just allows us to kind of debug things a little bit better as well. You see we're at 82. And if we load back in and shift right click, we should still be at 82. Just make sure that it's incrementing correctly, and yeah, that all works perfectly fine. And you see that sends all into chat as well as a general system message. So yeah, that's it for this tutorial. I know it's been really long, or at least as of recording it's quite long. It's currently an hour long, Hopefully I can get it a little bit shorter than that in editing, but I will apologize for the length in advance because it's probably still quite long. However, if you did find this tutorial useful, then please do be sure to give it a like and subscribe. And also my Patreon is linked in the description, so if you want to help support me to continue making tutorials, that is definitely the place to go. And also my Discord server is linked in the description as well, so if you have any issues or you just want to come and chat and hang out, then that is a great place to be. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next tutorial where we will be discussing block entity ticking. So yeah, I'll see you then. Goodbye.